Hello everyone, my name is Rumi Sakamoto, and as you can see, this is a recording because I can't be with you in real time because I am in New Zealand. But I'm very grateful for having this opportunity to be part of this lecture series, and I would like to say thank you to Dr. Christopher Sommers for inviting me to be part of this lecture series. Now, one of my research interests is war and war memories in popular culture, popular media, and also museums. So today I am going to talk about the Japanese case entitled Exhibiting Military History in a Pacifist Nation. And I'm going to be focusing on a Japanese war museum called Yushukan in Tokyo. I will first look at how this museum uses affective strategies to influence visitors' understanding of the past and experience of the past, and then look at some visitor responses as well. Okay. I'd like to locate my analysis in the context of post-war pacifism. So let's look at this briefly first. As you know, Japan was defeated, and following the defeat, there were occupation by the US for about 7 years. The US drafted the Japanese constitution, which is now known as a peace constitution with Article 9, which you can see on the slide. It states that Japan renounces the war and prohibits military, and as a defeated nation and only country that has ever suffered the A-bomb attack, Japan became known for its pacifism. The pacifism and anti-war sentiment permeated the society throughout the post-war period. Meanwhile, Japan's own wartime aggression became something to be ashamed of and forgotten. Positive depiction of war and military became somewhat a taboo, and the hero narrative around the war, seen in many other countries, was impeded. The widespread pacifist ethos can be also found in this kind of survey that asks people if they are willing to fight for the nation, where Japan always comes at the bottom with the least percentage of the people who say that they're willing to fight for the country. The dominant mode of representing the war in Japan has been that of collective trauma and victimhood. There is no state war museum in Japan, and public museums like the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum and the National Showa Memorial Museum depict the war in terms of the suffering of ordinary people, not what the Japanese military did during the war. Such museums show no large weapons, fighter planes or cannons, and they don't tell heroic war stories. What we see instead is the hardship of the citizens at the home front, linked with a strong desire for peace. It is this kind of representation, not military history, that has come to shape the post-war Japanese public consciousness about the war. Now, in this context, Yushukan is unique. This private museum, operated by the Yasukuni Shrine, is the most well-known museum of military history in Japan, with the annual visitor number of around 300,000, which is smaller than Hiroshima Memorial Park but larger than Showa Memorial Museum. It used to be regarded as an anachronistic, right-wing kind of place, and it was even likened to a shabby antique shop which no one visited. But over the last decades, especially after the renovation in 2002, that added a substantial historiography of Japan's wars and an audiovisual room, it has emerged as a key site of patriotic memories. Unlike most other museums in Japan that involve war themes, this museum makes no reference to the horrific effect of the air raids or the extreme poverty and suffering of the home front. Rather, it solely focuses on who, I quote, dedicated their precious lives to their loving motherland, hometowns, and families. It gained popularity in parallel with the rise of neo-nationalism, and it has been criticized by the scholars and left liberals along with the controversial Yasukuni Shrine itself, which enshrines the Class A war criminals. Yet it remains as a high-profile memory site that attracts visitors throughout Japan. As a history museum, the Yushukan locates various war-related artifacts with a revisionist war historiography. If we look at the historiography first, although it covers the history of Japanese military since samurai era, its focus is the Asia-Pacific War. More than half of the exhibition is dedicated to the history of military conflict since the 1930s. As I mentioned earlier, Yushukan presents a revisionist history, which in Japanese context means an interpretation of Japan's imperial expansion and war as justifiable, and the Tokyo Tribunal as the victor's justice that was unfairly pushed on Japan. The ideological nature of the Yushukan's narrative is clear, for example, in the use of the term the Greater Eastern Asian War, which implies that the aim of Japanese expansion was to liberate Asia from Western imperialism. Japan is shown as a victim who tried to avoid the war very hard, but ultimately was given no choice but to fight. The start of the Sino-Japanese War is explained in terms of the Chinese population's anti-Japanese sentiments and Chinese provocation. The Nanjing massacre, here called Nanjing Incident, is treated as a minor incident with a display panel explaining that the Japanese general in charge told his men to maintain strict military disciplines and that anyone committing unlawful acts would be severely punished. A copy of the newspaper article reporting that the locals welcomed the Japanese with a heading, "Peace was recovered in Nanjing," is also on display, obfuscating the reality of the large-scale massacre. In short, its historiography tells a story of righteous war, of self-defense, and downplays the atrocities committed by the Japanese military. It emphasizes honorable intention and the unfair treatment of Japan by the West. Since the artifacts from the past are located within this specific ideological narrative, it seems that the objective of the museum is to encourage patriotic identity amongst the visitors, in line with the contemporary revisionist nationalism. In the next part, I will look at Yushukan's effective strategies that complement its revisionist history. I hope to show that it is designed to produce effective responses amongst the visitors by first the cultural trope of the tragic hero, and secondly, humanizing the war dead, and thirdly, religious and spiritual atmosphere. Okay, first, the tragic hero. Yushukan puts a lot of emphasis on those who died in suicide attacks and represents them in line with the culturally familiar trope of tragic hero. Aestheticization of suicide and self-sacrifice is something that is quite common in traditional Japanese culture, and the cultural typecast of the tragic hero who embraces their own death for a higher cause, something larger than oneself. So that tragic hero is often, and they tend to be in a losing battle too. So winning is not necessary ingredients here. You are a hero not because you win or contribute to the winning, but even if you are losing, there is a beauty in losing battle itself. And this is something that strikes a chord with Japanese people even today. Yushukan puts a lot of focus on those who accepted their own death as a fate, especially those who became the human weapons when Japan's defeat was obvious and imminent. Their farewell notes and wills expressing their resolve to die and gratitude to their parents, which are given central place, encourage the visitors to interpret such stories with the familiar cultural code of tragic but beautiful death. What visitors are not told, however, is that these letters and wills were censored by the military, or that the majority of Japan's war dead died from starvation and illness. It is likely that most military deaths were neither beautiful nor honorable, just miserable and meaningless deaths, but here kamikaze and other acts of self-sacrifice and their pure, beautiful spirits are highlighted. This amounts to a sentimental representation without any context, but it is effective to stimulate affective, emotional engagement of the visitors. In addition to the tragic hero trope, another strategy to encourage affective engagement is the humanization of the military war dead. At the core of Yushukan exhibits are the stories of named individuals. The museum makes clear effort at humanizing these people with photographs, personal episodes, diaries, letters, and various artifacts. They appear relatable as members of family and friends, sometimes with reference to their hobbies or personalities, such as a man of great effort, a person of keen humanity, or deep sympathy with his subordinate. Most exhibited objects belong to specific named individuals. For example, the military cap worn by Major Hotta, a holster worn by Lieutenant General Minakami, a ripped cuff from the uniform of Commander Iwasa. These artifacts that were left behind after the owner's death reinforce the sense of loss. Other examples of humanization include a father's letter to a 3-year-old daughter written just before his suicide attack, or a comical sketch of everyday life included in a letter to the family. Family relations are particularly emphasized through artifacts such as letters from siblings, a will addressed to the parents, or gift from a mother to her son. Many of the exhibited wills and letters express gratitude and care for the parents, especially the mothers. Some of the exhibited objects not only point to the wartime history, but speak to the sorrow of the families left behind many years after the war, directing the visitors to the perspective of the bereaved family. The mess tin used for cooking rice, pictured here on the left of the slide, apparently was miraculously found after 30 years, so 30 years after the owner's death, in a jungle on Solomon Islands by his very son. The coconut, pictured on the right, with an engraved name of a soldier, had been set adrift in Manila Harbor a year before he was killed in action. And this was addressed to his hometown friend and found after 31 years of supposedly drifting in the sea and returned to his wife. So both stories are given substantial treatment in the museum, and through objects encourage the visitors to reflect on the lasting pain after 30 years of the death of those who they loved. Okay, now these are the so-called bridal dolls, and they are dedicated by the bereaved families, especially and mothers, as brides to the young men whose lives were cut short before they could even know a woman. So this is a bridal doll. Now, one of these bridal dolls is accompanied with a letter written by the mother to the dead son. And she is in this letter expressing her sorrow more than 50 years after the war. She was 84 years when she dedicated this doll and wrote this letter. So just like the story of the rice tin and the miraculous coconut, through the grief of the aging mother, the sense of the loss that continued after, many years after the war, touches on many people. These personal and relatable stories trigger emotional response, which provides experiential function for the visitors, because visitors actually feel something in their body right on that spot, right? It's a feeling, it's the affective impact. They experience it there. So that's what I mean, the experiential function for the visitors. The stories and names, not just the object from the past, ensure this emotional engagement and experience of authenticity of history, connecting contemporary visitors to the past. Thirdly, the element of the sacred. Located within a Shinto shrine, Yushukan exudes the atmosphere of sacred. Throughout the museum, the military dead are shown not just as tragic heroes or as fathers, sons, or brothers, but as eire, which in Japanese means glorious or noble spirit, glorious spirit. In the Shinto tradition, all dead become kami, or a Shinto god. To signify their divine status, all the military dead in this museum appears with a special Shinto name called okurina attached to their names, and the word eire is used throughout. Museums, as a product of modernity and enlightenment, are usually considered as secular places. There is much scholarly concern over exhibiting religious objects in museum setting out of their original context, but Yushukan, which belongs to a Shinto shrine, there isn't the contradiction between the religion and its exhibit. It is a religious site as much as it is a museum of war and military history. So Shintoism is really embedded in exhibitions. For example, Room 5 describes the history of Yasukuni Shrine and its rituals, describing the enshrinement of the war dead as Japanese traditional faith. Room 9 holds a palanquin used in the ritual of enshrinement of the war dead, and the text panel describes the process of the ceremony in some detail, using esoteric Shinto vocabularies that are unfamiliar with contemporary visitors. This conjures up a feeling of sacred unworldliness, eliciting sense of respect. Military history is thus contextualized in religious meaning-making, secular exposition of war history, and non-secular religious elements. They mingle with each other. The material environment such as low lighting, dark floors, and minimalist display, as well as its physical location of being on the ground of a Shinto shrine, reinforces the religious context, indicating that this is a sacred space with intangible meaning. As a museum, it is a very different space from, for example, the aforementioned Showakan Museum, which aims to educate visitors about the life during the war with many interactive exhibits. Yushukan is imbued with religious meanings and feelings and encourages a spiritual orientation and contemplative mood to engage, for the visitors to engage. Today's Japan is largely atheist, with only a small minority practicing Shinto. But a generalized appreciation of intangible spirit and non-material aspect of life is widely shared as a part of cultural life. As such, the spiritual connotation of the exhibit is easily communicated and may be uncritically accepted by domestic visitors. Visitor comments certainly indicate that the museum's reference to spirituality resonate with many people. By commemorating the military dead who gave up their lives for the country, by religious act of enshrinement, Yasukuni and Yushukan interpret the death as sacred sacrifice for a worthy cause. While the notion of honoring the military dead is common in many war museums, Yushukan's powerful religious connotation and the definition of the war dead as divinities give this museum a special affective quality. Combined with the culturally familiar trope of tragic hero and personalized and humanized stories, the overall effect is emotionally powerful display drenched in affect and a unique sense of sublime. The last 4 exhibition rooms are called Gods of Yasukuni and are dedicated to the mementos of the military personnel who died in the war. Unlike other sections of the museum, these rooms contain little historiography, maps, or an explanation of military tactics. It feels more like a personal memorialization site than a history museum. Visitors are encouraged to directly engage with artifacts like diary entry, the last poem, final message to the parents, and so on. And I've observed that people tend to spend a lot of time in these particular rooms. Here we can see a combination of the sacred and ordinary, the kami status and humanization. Some of them are in baseball uniform because they were baseball players when they were alive, and others are in military uniform, all of them with special Shinto ocarina names. While it may seem contradictory to represent them as both relatable human beings and God, Kami, the logic here is that ordinary men have become divine through their death for the nation. To summarize the points so far, Yushukan deals with the military death by humanizing the war dead, couching them with a culturally familiar narrative of the tragic hero, and placing them in a religious context. The combination creates a highly emotional atmosphere which controls the interaction of the visitors with the past. The museum's intention seems to be emotionalizing visitors towards its own version of historiography that is politically motivated and patriotic. As the visitors engage affectively with letters, diaries, artifacts, and individual stories, they become the witnesses of history. The authenticity of their emotion, that is, the very real impact of the affects felt through their bodies, can then be confounded with the authenticity of the historical narrative presented there. To consider such an intertwining of history and emotion, I would now like to look at some visitor responses. Every month, Yushukan selects and publishes some of the comments left in the visitor notes. I have analyzed 151 such visitor responses published on their website between 2017 and 2022. We can assume that the selection reflects the ideal response that echoes the museum's own stance, and therefore these are not necessarily representative of all visitors. Many visitors don't even write anything on the visitor books, and only a small portion of those who have actually written in the notes are represented in the published version of the visitor voices. When I read through the actual visitor books in the museum, I did find some critical messages towards the museum and its historiography, but of course none of these negative comments appear on the published version. Now, having said that, I believe that these are genuine visitor voices because many of the comments I did read in the museum reflected similar moods and ideas as the ones that are published on their website. Anyways, several themes have emerged. First, affective response. A large majority of the comments mention emotional and affective experience at the museum using words and phrases like tears, goosebumps, shock, couldn't stop crying, deeply moved, heart-wrenching, broke my heart, overwhelmed, stuck speechless. A national focus on patriotism are also obvious. Phrases like Japanese pride and Japanese spirit appear multiple times. Expressions like glad I was born as Japanese and I love Japan are also common, and statements like I'm proud that many people defended Japan, I have come to love Japan even more, or I felt strongly that I must live for Japan as Japanese and in a Japanese way suggests that the museum evokes national consciousness and produces national subjects. Concern over the present and future Japan is expressed, sometimes accompanied with an expression of desire to contribute to the country and even fight for the nation in future. For example, does contemporary Japan have the courage to fight an external enemy? Do they have a desire to protect Japan? No one wants war, but if peace is threatened, then I will fight. There is all there is to it. Many indicate that the visit to the museum gave them a transformative experience, expressing something akin to revelation, enlightenment, or spiritual elevation, which then leads to an expression of or determination to live differently from then on. They declare personal intention to contribute to the country, to be a proud Japanese, to protect Japan, or more generally to live well and do one's best in life. It seems that having learned the plight of the tragic heroes who sacrificed their own life for the nation, they or the family, many people reflect their own life. For example, thinking that those people of my age who fought with personal conviction, I feel ashamed of my own lack of virtue. Will I be able to fight if I'm told to fight? Am I prepared to die? Or, reading the wills written by those who were as young as 20 years old, I could feel their pure heart. Do I have that? Thank you for reminding me of such an important thing. I too will live for others. Many express desires and intention to transmit that what they have learned in Yushukan to future generations and children. And some urge other Japanese to learn and act. For example, I'm going to tell young people what the Japanese did, I will start taking action. Or, as an educator, I will teach the young generation who will bear the nation's future about the sincere mind, dignity, and the past of the Japanese. And we cannot justify the state of today's Japan and the Japanese to the noble spirits who lost their lives to defend Japan. Why are the Japanese not able to love Japan? Be proud, Japanese people. If the museum aims to motivate the visitors to patriotism and call them to action, these examples suggest that it has been successful in constructing a collective and symbolic as the Japanese and making them want to act, be it living differently with a new resolve or communicating their experience at the museum and influencing others. It seems that visitors are not just learning about the past in the museum, but using the past to reflect on and inspire themselves in the present and future. Another very common element is the gratitude to the war dead, who are usually referred to either as noble spirits or ancestors in line with the Shinto belief, for having defended Japan and built today's Japan. That those who are living today cannot ever even repay the sacrifice, and therefore the living all their lives to the dead is a common sentiment. Lastly, many people commented that at Yushukan they have learned the history that schools don't teach. This often appears along with the criticism of history education in Japan. Biased education at school is contrasted with the correct history at Yushukan. For example, at school I was taught that Japan acted badly in war, but I don't think that's correct. Schools do not teach that Japan's aim was to defend Asia. We need to educate and teach correct history to our children, that these people fight for families and futures of Japan. These visitors seem to find the museum's historical narrative valuable because it has opened their eyes to the true history that is missing from the school curriculum. One note reads, "I am in shock and full of regret because there are so many things I didn't know about Japanese history." The last quotation on the slide here captures a common sentiment, bringing together patriotism, gratitude, view of history, and criticisms of school education. We should stop showing children the atomic bomb dome and teaching them that Japan was bad. Choose this museum for school trips. That will make everyone in Japan like Japan more and live without losing the sense of gratitude who lost their lives for Japan. Insofar as the personal artifacts and stories, the tragic hero narrative, and the religious connotation are all located within the revisionist history, they serve a political cause of influencing visitors' understanding and experience of the history and shaping cultural memory. Comments like these reproduce Yushukan's narrative that Japan fought a just war. The Great East Asian War was not a war of invasion. What wrong did Japan do? Our ancestors who defended the nation were splendid. Of course, pure intent and subjectively altruistic motivation of individual soldiers or the bereavement of the family do not make Japan's war a just war or redemptive. But the affect-drenched and venerated images of young men who accepted their own death for something larger than their own lives makes it seem wrong, insulting even, to think they were part of the war of invasion, that they were the aggressors and victimizers. The political intention of the museum is perhaps best captured in this type of comment that draws lesson for today's Japan from Yushukan's interpretation of the past. I would like to thank sincerely to everyone who fought and defended Japan and Asia, as well as Japanese pride. 70 years after the war, Japan needs to reflect the meaning of peace and war so that we can make a responsible choice. Although the writer doesn't specify what he or she means by responsible choice, it seems reasonable to see this as a reference to the current debate around the revision of the Article 9 and remilitarization of the country. Thus, judging from these published visitor responses, Yushukan's attempt to construct patriotic memories and mobilize the public seems quite successful. As I mentioned earlier, however, we must be mindful of the selection bias. These visitor voices are chosen because they reflect what the museum wants its visitors to experience and understand. Once published on the museum's website, they become a part of the Yushukan's attempt to construct patriotic memories and influence the public. To capture broader visitor perception, I have also examined some blog entries about Yushukan covering the same 5-year period from 2017 to 2022. Out of the around 800 entries picked up by a search engine, I have analyzed about 100 that described actual visits and the blogger's personal response to the museum and its exhibit. What I found is a wider variety of response compared to the visitor comments published by Yushukan. Most notably, several bloggers criticized the museum. For example, one person wrote, "I was ashamed, no reference to what Japan did in Asia, just insisting that it was a war of self-defense." There were posts that mentioned Japanese pride and just war, and some stated that the museum made them realize that the school textbooks were incorrect and that exhibitions opened their eyes to the truth. But these were minority. Also, 3 bloggers explicitly linked the museum visit to the idea of future national defense and security, increasing Japan's military capacity, that kind of thing. But all of these were actually a member of right-leaning political parties. Their blogs were designed to promote their political views. So it's likely that they visited Yushukan to reinforce what they already believe, rather than the museum visit influenced their sense of identity and subjectivity. Overall, the blogger-visitor responses were not as closely aligned with the narrative context of the museum itself. Since each person brings to the museum space their own ideas and own expectation, they encounter with the exhibit differently. For example, 2 bloggers drew a link between the Second World War suicide forces and today's so-called black companies, which means exploitative companies in Japanese, recognizing in both the systematic victimization of the younger people by the older people. One person even concluded her blog about the museum visit with a renewed commitment to losing weight by diet and exercise. Clearly, people articulate their experience of visiting the museum in different contexts. Still, despite the relative wide variety, there were some common elements. Just like the visitor notes published on the museum's website, an overwhelming proportion of the blog entries contained words that describe affect, such as tears, sadness, and tightening of chest. The perception of the sacred were also recurrent, with quite a few bloggers talking about supernatural presences. Many blog posts focused solely on suicide attacks and various weapons used for them, completely ignoring the rest of the exhibitions. One difference from the visitor voices on the museum's website is that the bloggers frequently express the sentiment of pacifism and no war. These quotes you can see on the slide are just some of the examples. Yushukan teaches us how cruel and terrifying the war is. I felt that we must never again repeat a war. To reflect on our commitment to peace, that is what we can do today. We should not forget about the war. No matter whether one wins or loses, war is devastating. I could not help but pray that there will be no war. War should not happen. Many people wrote how terrible and miserable the war is and hoped that war would never happen and expressed their appreciation of peace. Several recent blog entries mentioned Russian invasion of Ukraine in this context. The sentiment that 1, war's terrible, 2, it should never happen, and 3, peace is good, have been the core elements of the post-war Japanese pacifism, and it seems that many people interpreted their museum visits in the framework of this post-war pacifism. Thus, the blog entries generally showed a strong identification with and ethical sympathy with the military dead and families. Yet, such identification and sympathy were rarely articulated with the idea of the honor, glory, and a patriotic commitment to the nation. Thomas Beaumont, writing about the U.S. war memorials, such as the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery and Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, has argued that effective responses to war memorials reinforce notion of redemptive violence in ways that render violence as a community-building exercise. In other words, he's saying that war memorials encourage and naturalize the strong feeling of because they died for us, we have to repay by being prepared to die ourselves. Yushukan's juxtaposition of the revisionist history with the affect-drenched displays, as well as its selection of specific types of visitor voices, suggests that a similar effect is intended. But my analysis has shown that redemptive violence is not the only or main mode of response. There is no doubt that the museum successfully invokes intense emotion as well as identification and sympathy with the dead soldiers and families whose stories they display. Visitor voices on the museum's website and blogs alike demonstrate people's strong response to the Yushukan's affective strategies. At the same time, such affective engagement does not always lead to the visitor acceptance of the idea of the moral war, glorification of self-sacrifice for the country, or justification of future militarization. Regardless of what the museum might want, many visitors are interpreting Yushukan in the wider context of the post-war pacifism and focus on the terrible plight of the young soldiers rather than worshipping them as a hero. To conclude, Yushukan's tragic hero narrative, humanization of the military dead, and religious connotation together produce a sentimental representation of the military dead, which appeals to the visitors. Its display of the objects and artifacts are not simply designed to recreate the history and the reality of the war, but to conjure up an intense affective response in support of its ideological stance. As Japan navigates a transition from pacifist nation whose constitution prohibits military to a country that can fight with offensive military capabilities, the act of remembering the war can potentially contribute to the production of national subjects who's willing to die and kill for the nation in future wars. Yushukan's revisionist history, aestheticization of self-sacrifice, as well as the published visitor responses certainly point to such directions. At the same time, however, the analysis of the blog postings have reminded us that a museum cannot control each visitor's response. Regardless the museum's intention, and despite what seems like an almost universal affective response to its exhibit, there is a space between emotion and interpretation, as each visitor ascribes meaning to the exhibited material, cross-referencing what they see in their own context. Anti-war pacifism still remains as a meaningful reference point in Japan, at least at this point of history. Thank you. That's all.